Hello everyone. Well, I covered Module 7, so now we're on to Module 8. If I cover any more modules after this one, it's going to be a very long time in coming. Alright, so, the social construction of race. I love how some statements make sense only if you forcibly replace a word's definition with an entirely new definition. Because society did not decide what skin color I was born with. It's just a reflection of the genetic makeup of my parents. So the only way the title of this video works is by giving race a different meaning. But hey, this is coming from Stanford, the number 5 top-rated university in the country. So there has to be something to this, right? Let's take a look.
I think it's helpful to think about whiteness and blackness as poles of a spectrum.
Yes, the visible spectrum of light is generally bookended on either extreme by white and black. I didn't realize this was a science class. Are we going to be discussing Newtonian physics next?
Over the course of our history, whiteness is the pole of privilege. So high income, education. Blackness, on the other hand, is associated with stigma. It's marginalized, disadvantaged, the opposite. So less income, poverty, welfare receipt, incarceration, for example.
Over the course of our history. Whose history? Mankind? America? You and your family? There are no poor white people. There are no rich black people? All white people have PhDs? No black person has risen above a GED? Are you saying whiteness is just an inherently more successful trait than blackness? Do you understand how fundamentally racist a notion that is? Okay. Let me take a step back. I have made this kind of mistake before, as with white feminism and black feminism. Maybe she's using these terms to describe opposing concepts that don't involve skin color, like white magic versus black magic. Let's hear her out.
If we assume that race is not fixed, if someone can be classified in one group or the other or somewhere in between across the course of their lives, it actually tells us something about the relationship between race and inequality.
If we assume race is not fixed, assuming that something demonstrably true is not true does not then make that thing untrue, unless you believe in magic. And this is where I would insert part of the chorus from Do You Believe in Magic if I didn't fear a copyright strike. But, okay, another step back here. So far, our speaker has classified whiteness and blackness as representing two extremes of economic and academic success. Whiteness means rich and well-educated, blackness means poor and uneducated. Why did she not use the more common terms of upper class and lower class is beyond me, since wealth and education is not determined by skin color. Unless you're a racist. And I have to conclude that she is talking about skin color here, because absent some new convoluted definition of the word race, we're not talking about broad concepts that just happen to involve the words white and black. So she's suggesting that one's race can shift over the course of their lives, that it can morph from one group to another. So let me try to understand this. Emphasis on the word try. If I am a millionaire on Monday, and being rich is whiteness, then I am white? And if I then go bankrupt on Tuesday, and being poor is blackness, then I become black? My skin color, ethnicity, and heritage are not dictated by the size of my bank account. How exactly is this supposed to work?
In order to demonstrate that race is not fixed, I actually had to use the data that was currently available, because if nobody believes that race is flexible, no one wants to collect data.
Wait, what? You had to use the data that was currently available, right? Okay, good on you for using current data. I don't see why that would be anything special. But what was that last part?
Because if nobody believes that race is flexible, no one wants to collect data.
If no one believes race is flexible, then no one wants to collect data. But you are proposing that race is flexible. You must believe it to be possible, if not outright true. What was preventing you from collecting new data?
And so there's a bit of a catch-22. You have to convince people that race is flexible using data that typically doesn't think that this is the case.
What? Wait. You have to convince people that race is flexible using data that typically doesn't think this is the case. I don't even know where to begin with how insane that statement sounds. Like, you have to convince people that the Earth is flat using data that doesn't think this is the case. Holy cow. Our speaker is attempting to ice skate uphill. I cannot wait to see what she says next.
I rely pretty heavily on the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and in particular the 1979 cohort. So these are American men and women who were ages 14 to 22 at the time that they were first interviewed. And then the interviews follow them across their life. We know what their income is and what their education is in terms of how many years of school they've completed and what degrees they've acquired.
The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979 cohort originally included 12,686 respondents, but over the years it has been reduced to 9,964 respondents. Since 1994, they have all been interviewed every 2 years to track their progress. So as far as the website is concerned, the data from 1979 through 2012 is available. Okay, at least we know the currency of what our speaker is working with. Now, relying on a single source for your conclusions is a little shaky, but at least the sample size is quite large.
And all of these are what we would consider measures of socioeconomic status. They're also asked to classify the respondent by race, using the categories white, black, and other.
Actually, the categories they used were Hispanic, black, and non-black non-Hispanics. But hey, who's worried about the little details when making use of a decades-long scientific study to reach your conclusions? Am I right, Professor? And something she said there really caught my brain specifically. They're also asked to classify the respondent by race. I wondered who they were. Sounded odd. But it's true. In the initial interviews, determining the race of the respondents was indeed up to the interviewer. And the website for the study makes sure to note clearly that the interviewer's assessment of race is subjective. It should also be noted that by the 2002 round of interviews, the respondents themselves indicated their own race for the survey. I would be curious to know how much of those answers varied from the interviewer's initial assessments. Was there much of a variance? Does our professor ask that question? No.
We hypothesized that if people were aware of racial disparities in these factors or had stereotypes about who was more likely to go to prison or who was more likely to receive welfare or who was more likely to lose their job, that those assumptions might also then affect how they classified the respondents when they were asked to assign them a race.
Hold on. Let's go back to the list of racial classifications used in the study. Look at the classification options given to the interviewers, for example, under the Hispanics category. Persons who did not self-identify as Hispanic, but who met the following conditions were also classified as Hispanic. Those who identified themselves in the ethnic origin categories that included Filipino or Portuguese, those whose householder or householder's spouse reported speaking Spanish at home as a child, and those whose family's surname is listed on the census list of Spanish surnames. None of those things involve economic status. They're a reflection of the reality of the respondent's self-identification or other identifiable factors of language or parentage that might tend to indicate ethnicity. Yes, the interviewer's assessments were subjective. None of us are mind readers. But what you're leaning towards here is a maybe. Maybe the interviewers were biased by other factors. Well, you purportedly possess all of the self-identification the respondents have given regarding their race since 2002. Were the interviewers off base in their assessments, or not? Wouldn't that be the starting point to ask such questions?
For example, with unemployment, it was measured in terms of whether or not the respondent had been out of work for at least 4 months in the year prior to the survey. And what we see is that if the interviewer heard that the respondent had been out of work, this did appear to affect their classification. So, for example, person 343 is seen as Black 33% of the time prior to experiencing unemployment and 100% of the time after they experienced unemployment.
It appeared to affect their classification. Was unemployment the only variable between interviews? How did person 343 self-identify racially? What does person 343 look like? Were all of the interviews conducted in person? How many of those were done over the phone when the interviewer could not see person 343? And how does that square with your numbers? And more importantly, of all of the 25 available interviews conducted since 1979, how many of them had person 343 as employed, and how many of them as unemployed? What were they classified as by the interviewer the other 67% of the time? Was it white? You don't say it was white. Why wouldn't you say it was white?
So it's not just that race is changing over time, but that it's changing in ways that are clearly related to these changes in social status.
Their race did not change. One interviewer's subjective assessment differed from another interviewer's subjective assessment. Why are you conflating observable fact with subjective assessment? And clearly related? You named one variable from the interviews and said that it appeared to affect the interviewer's assessment. That's not clear. That's a guess.
So that once you experience unemployment, it pulls you away from whiteness and pushes you towards Blackness in terms of the way that other people perceive you.
A Black man is walking down the street in an Armani suit, looking as sharp as a tack and as professional as Leon. So, absent any other information, people perceive him as white? I mean, for all they know, he might be unemployed and out at a job interview. But they wouldn't know his employment status just by looking at him. And even if they did, you're telling me that your race is determined by your perceived status in the world? If I don't perceive a white man as poor, he's white. And if I don't perceive a Black man as rich, he's Black? What?
Over the course of the whole span, so the 19 years of the survey, 20% of the respondents experienced at least one change in how they're classified by the interviewer by race.
20% had at least one instance of being reclassified. How many of those went from Black to non-Black? How many of those went from Hispanic to Black? How many of those went from non-Black to Black? That doesn't tell us anything except that the subjective assessments can vary because they are subjective. And we have data from well past 1998. The available studies go through 2012. Why are those not included?
The relationship between race and inequality is not just about when people change race, but also about when their race stays stable from one year to the next. Another racial stereotype in the United States is related to contact with the criminal justice system. And this new survey had a measure of whether or not the respondents had been arrested since the previous wave of the survey. So, for example, if someone had been previously classified as Black by the interviewer and had reported an arrest since the previous survey wave, they were more likely to be classified as Black by the interviewer again in the subsequent year.
So what happened with non-Black or Hispanic respondents under those same circumstances? Did their race remain steady if they had been arrested?
At the same time, if someone had not been classified as Black in the previous survey year and they'd experienced an arrest in between the two surveys, they were more likely to be classified as Black by the interviewer in the subsequent year.
3%. That's it. That doesn't fall within a statistical margin of error? Are you serious?
So people stay Black when they've experienced contact with the criminal justice system, and they switch to Black when they've experienced contact with the criminal justice system, so the association between Blackness and crime is maintained.
Maybe I am missing something. Maybe our speaker has access to things I do not. Because I went and looked up this study she is citing. and I found the list of questions posed to the respondents at the beginning of the study in Wave 1. These are questions asked of the respondent. This is not interviewer interpretation or subjective assessment. Again, maybe you have info I am unaware of, but if there was a variance in racial identification, it came from the respondents themselves.
In order to confirm the results from the surveys, my colleague and I teamed up with some social psychologists to run an experiment.
I guess these colleagues must have already believed that race is flexible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have wanted to collect any data. Right?
The experiment asked people to classify the faces that they see as either white or black. We varied the faces as a spectrum from the most stereotypically white face to the most stereotypically black face.
Many of the interviews were conducted over the phone where the interviewer could not see the respondent. How did you test for those situations? Just curious.
We also dressed these faces either in a suit or in a kind of t-shirt and coveralls to emphasize high status and low status.
Wait, where's your control group? Where's the batch of examples wearing neutral clothing, or maybe just faces with no clothing at all? You did use a control group, didn't you?
And it uses a novel kind of software that tracks mouse movements. So we were both interested in what category they chose when they saw these faces, but also interested in the actual trajectory that the mouse took as they moved either up and to the left or up and to the right. So you could use the XY coordinates of the mouse to, in a sense, see them thinking about the categorization process.
You used mouse movement as a mind reader. You used motor skills to determine subconscious bias. Sure. Okay. That doesn't sound like subjective quackery at all.
The video depicts the average mouse trajectories of classifications for the exact same face. When the subjects saw the man in the suit, they were more likely to go directly toward the corner of the screen that corresponded to the white category. In contrast, when they saw the same face wearing the t-shirt and coveralls, the mouse trajectory veered ever so slightly towards the black category, even when they ultimately selected the white category. They're taking into account not only the physical information about the person's face, but also the status information that was implied by their clothing.
You are not reading minds. I know this might be a revelation to you, but you have no way of making those claims objectively. You do not know what your subjects were thinking, or why their hands moved the way they did. A simple hesitation in assessment of race, given the gradients of skin color you provided in the pictures, would also explain the mouse movement, wouldn't it? How do you know it was the clothing?
When we study inequality, we often think about race as something that's an input into the system. So you're born white, you're born black, you're born Asian, and that affects the kinds of opportunities and outcomes that you can expect in your life. That's certainly true, and we have lots of research to demonstrate that.
Really? Care to cite any? How does it compare to white homelessness in this country? How does it stack up against the aggregate wealth of the Asian population in this country?
But we also need to think about race as an output from these systems, so that once you've experienced upward mobility or downward mobility, that then reflects back on how people perceive you by race.
The changes in your bank account do not change your race. Your race determines your race. And your declarations that economic status equates to perceived race is fundamentally racist. Do you see that? Or can you not distinguish between your assumptions of other people's perceptions and objective reality?
It isn't stable over time. We can't simply talk about gaps in wages between whites and blacks, or gaps in test scores between whites and blacks, as if those are two separate mutually exclusive groups of people.
You started this video classifying the world into two categories, whiteness and blackness. And now you say we cannot think of whites and blacks as two mutually exclusive groups of people when your entire presentation of data depends on the purported shifting from one race to another race. Working through this video has turned my brain topsy-turvy, because if I am to take this woman at her word, then the world sees the homeless guy down the street as black and the current president of the United States as white, when neither is the case. I am bewildered. As always, thanks for watching.